Hey everybody, Dr. Dave here. This is just going to be a kind of expansion of some things that I think I'm going to blow through pretty quickly in class when we talk about this. So just wanted to record this to be able to go in depth a little bit more on the timeline of cannabis prohibition policies and dig into that a little bit here. So same title as the slideshow that we used in class, kind of when cannabis became evil. And I do think the title is important here because this whole period of prohibition and those in power really did infuse this belief that cannabis is evil, and it infused it into our national and then really the eventual international consciousness. And policies across all levels of government enforced this single story that in many ways affected science and culture and criminality. And then alongside these policies, mainstream culture and the social and medical and natural sciences also adopted this singular definition that essentially cannabis was evil. So what happened? How did this happen is, we need to think about this, one, so we don't make mistakes moving forward. Um, but it really does help to understand it. I mean, around the turn of the century, cannabis was largely this uncontroversial kind of folk medicine or natural remedy. There was this period where physicians would use cannabis with patients. There were some pharmaceuticals companies making cannabis patients or cannabis medicines. There were pockets of recreational consumption in the US and Europe. And certainly in many communities, as we talked about last week, throughout the world, it was a staple of their culture. And we started with that and then went to this point in a relatively short period of time where cannabis was considered to be one of the most dangerous substances on the planet. So we're going to go through this timeline, kind of starting around 1900. There's a lot of information in your resources if you really want to dig into the history more. There's a couple podcasts, a couple articles. We're going to talk about this some in class, but for this lecture, I really just want to dig into the timeline a little bit more so you have that information. So again, we're starting around 1900, where again, cannabis was freely available at drugstores, generally in tinctures. There was some hashish around as well, especially in Europe. And it was a common ingredient in a variety of pharmaceutical medications. And the majority of physicians use cannabis as a treatment in some fashion. And as we talked last week, some of the boundaries of what we might consider rec and med were blurred a bit, but for the most part, it was primarily a medicinal substance. The term marijuana was initially unknown. And again, marijuana was really associated with cannabis flower, and cannabis flower was relatively unknown around the turn of the century. And cannabis flower became more widely known in the United States because it was part of Mexican culture. And then during the early 1900s, there was some significant Mexican immigration. And so the awareness of cannabis smoking became more known, but of course, then it also became a target for anti-immigrant sentiments. So that's kind of the landscape we're at around 1900 in the early part of the 20th century. The first thing we see of really significance is in 1906, the US government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this was really one of the first attempts to regulate and standardize commercial drugs as well as some foods. And really a lot of what started here, I don't know if you've ever heard of the book, The Jungle by the author Upton Sinclair, but this was published in 1906, and it basically told the story of the horrific conditions that was going on in the meatpacking industry. And won't go into detail, but needless to say, not how you want your meat treated. And so there was a big public outrage and said, hey, you need to do something, you need to take care of us. And so this public outrage prompted Congress to establish a federal responsibility for public health and welfare, something they really hadn't thought about or done much of before. So the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, and then what it did was prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated food and drugs, and really laid the foundation for the Food and Drug Administration. Again, they were attempting to make patent medications safer. Prior to that, you could just kind of make a medication and put whatever you wanted in it and kind of didn't have to label it accurately. So this was an attempt to make things safer. It allowed for testing and regulation of different substances, and it made a list of 10 ingredients that you had to list if you were including them in a medication. And of those 10 substances, cannabis was one of them. So this was a pretty big step and one of the first major steps that our government took in terms of regulating food and drugs. Um, and by listing these 10 substances, which included cannabis, it also began us kind of thinking about the language and the words we use. It began the use of the word drug is kind of something that was potentially bad and dangerous, and what I like to say is guilty until proven innocent, whereas kind of everything else that wasn't on this list was just kind of be considered fine until it was proven harmful. So we see this Pure Food and Drug Acts kind of set the stage for how we started thinking about and differentiating substances over the next several years. 1914, we passed the Harrison Act. This really wasn't specific to cannabis. It was really focused on opium and cocaine, and it added monitoring and taxation to manufacturing, distribution, and dispensing of opium and cocaine. Prior to that, opium and cocaine were, kind of freely available, just as cannabis was, and they were included in a variety of prescription medications. Um, Now, it was interesting. Opioid use, which really hit its peak in the late 1800s, was already really decreasing at this time. Opioid use and addiction probably weren't really a big problem. So you say, well, why did this Harrison Act go into play? It also is an example of setting the stage for moving forward. There was a lot of racial prejudices, especially against Chinese immigrants and African Americans, that really helped create fear that opioids were this huge problem. And again, especially on the racial side, that opioids would cause African Americans to go crazy and have sexual relations with white women. And again, we see this blueprint that would really be used for the next 100 years in regards of drug prohibition policies and kind of propaganda. And nonetheless, it was effective. It was passed, and it just added another step to the government being able to regulate and identify certain substances as dangerous while kind of leaving everything else aside. Kind of cannabis prohibition, we think of 1937 as when cannabis was prohibited, and that's true because that's really when federal prohibition went into effect. But really, over the first part of the 20th century, mainly between 1914 and 1925, various states did implement cannabis prohibition laws. In fact, by the time full prohibition went into place, um, 26 states had already passed laws prohibiting the plant on some level. And again, following this pattern of racial prejudices and kind of fear-based propaganda, many of the early prohibition laws started in states that were in the South and the West, where there was increased Mexican immigration. And again, people used this immigration to create fear and to kind of demonize this smoked form of cannabis, marijuana. And that was what was used to generate the public support that got these laws passed. Again, this playbook that kind of started with the Harrison Act of using fear of minorities or immigrants to kind of push your agenda. We see this continued with cannabis prohibition, and obviously continued for many years, which we'll keep talking about. Now, 1937 again is the kind of the year that we consider cannabis prohibition taking full effect. Um, but this process obviously had started previously and really kind of got going in the late 20s and early 1930s due to the work of really one man. His name was Harry Anslinger. He's probably the world's most important anti-cannabis leader, uh, really throughout history. Henry Anslinger took up the charge against cannabis starting in really the 1930s, and he became the leader of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the predecessor of the DEA, and he basically took it upon himself to make sure that the world viewed cannabis as evil and did anything he could to essentially stamp out its presence on the planet. Lots of debate as to why he was so passionate about this, really kind of beyond the scope of this class. But he did a whole lot of things. He started a huge propaganda campaign. He wrote the article that's called Marijuana Assassin of Youth that led directly to the kind of famous anti-cannabis film in 1936, Reefer Madness. Uh, and Anslinger, and at the head of this Federal Bureau of Narcotics, really dominated everything. They controlled drug research. They repressed findings that didn't match their agenda. They inserted extensive influence on the media and really ultimately shaped the discourse on cannabis for most of the 20th century. And again, these kind of racial prejudices and media propaganda was used earlier, as mentioned, with like the Harrison Act and other state prohibition efforts. But really, Harry Anslinger took it to a new level. He used the William Hearst newspaper industry to just demonize cannabis and put out false stories of cannabis causing murder and all kinds of kind of horrible atrocities, and really created a moral panic where even though nobody had really heard of marijuana, there wasn't a problem with it. He created this moral panic where average Americans now thought this was kind of menace number one. And of course, we see today, not just with drug policy, but with a variety of policies that politicians can create fear and get a pretty effective agenda passed. So kind of 1937 is that key date where really, essentially in the United States, cannabis became illegal. It was really more that it was taxed. You had to get a stamp saying you were allowed to possess marijuana, but essentially no one was allowed to get that stamp. So essentially made it illegal. And he continued his propaganda campaign throughout the late 30s into the 1940s, and really pretty effectively in a short period of time kind of made cannabis unacceptable across the board outside of some very small pockets of folks who were using it in a social or recreational setting. These anti-drug policies continued. The Boggs Act occurred in 1951, and really the Boggs Act was the first to make mandatory minimum prison sentences for drug crimes. So again, we start seeing this increased criminalization. First, it was just getting cannabis illegal, certainly arresting some people, but not widespread. With the Boggs Act, we start seeing more mandatory prison sentences. And then I don't have it on here, but in 1956, there was something called the Narcotics Control Act, which just expanded those sentences, again, making consumption or possession now a reason for incarceration. Now, a lot of this was occurring in the United States, but in combination with what was going on with the rise of communism after World War II and the Soviet Union, United States kind of exported their drug policies to the rest of the world. Not our best export, but in 1961, there was what was called the Single Convention on Narcotics Drugs. This was essentially a world meeting, a UN meeting. And this was the first time we start seeing, or not the first time, this was again a time we start seeing drugs listed in kind of criteria. And so the world made this list of substances that had a high potential for abuse, had no current accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety even under medical supervision. So this was the first time we started seeing schedules of drugs appear, with certain drugs in one category. These are terrible, they never help, they only cause harm, and they're extremely abusive, to different schedules where these drugs may have some risk but can be used and have benefit. And so, not surprisingly, cannabis was listed at the schedule that had only harm, no benefits, and most severe penalties. Now, this was an international um, policy, kind of making cannabis essentially illegal everywhere. While it was still illegal in the US, interestingly enough, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was challenged by none other than Timothy Leary, who, if you follow any psychedelic history, um, is prominent there. But he actually challenged the Marijuana Tax Act in 1969 and actually won. The Supreme Court ruled the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional. Unfortunately, that didn't mean cannabis became legal. What happened is, even though that Marijuana Tax Act was deemed unconstitutional, this is when Richard Nixon was in the presidency and had a pretty strong agenda on a variety of topics, but a pretty strong anti-cannabis and generally anti-substance agenda. And so Nixon immediately followed with the Controlled Substance Act of 1971. This essentially was a US act, but that established these schedules that we now still have today, Schedule 1 through 5 of different drugs. Cannabis was, of course, placed at the most severe schedule, Schedule 1, which means no acceptable use medicinally, extremely high risk of abuse, and extreme risk of severe, adverse effects or side effects. And that's when we talk about cannabis being Schedule 1 drug. This is when it started in 1971, and cannabis is federally still a Schedule 1 drug, despite all the evidence showing that the criteria for being a Schedule 1 drug are inaccurate when it comes to cannabis. But again, that started in 1971. And really, as part of that Controlled Substance Act, really, this is what's often considered the start of the true war on drugs. Now, as we've talked about, this war on cannabis and war on drugs really started significantly earlier, but Nixon kind of coined the term the war on drugs, and it became a huge aspect of his policies. And again, he really used the playbook of Harry Anslinger to really pressure media and the entertainment industries to just embed anti-substance campaigns in their messaging and in their programming, and really kind of took hold of this kind of anti-cannabis and anti-substance use dogma. And he had an agenda. This is actually a quote from Nixon's chief of staff, obviously not at the time, but in later years. And so now I'm quoting, "You want to know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or being black. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did." It's the end of the quote. So again, this anti-drug effort in this war on drugs really had a huge political agenda that was kind of outside the actual substance aspects. But nonetheless, it went into force, and it went into force in a very big way. And really, the war on drugs kicked into full gear. Now, obviously, Nixon didn't last in office for a whole host of other reasons, if you know any of your US history. And so this kind of war on drugs kind of backed off a little bit throughout the mid 70s because Nixon was gone, and other presidents didn't necessarily have this agenda that he had. But it kicked back in a big way. As we get to Ronald Reagan, President Reagan elected in 1980. Uh, he, for some of the same reasons as Nixon, political agenda, but really cranked up the war on drugs machine and cranked it up in a big way. What Nixon was really never able to do, but got started, Reagan took it to a whole new level. The Just Say No was the mantra of the anti-drug education campaign that was given to youth pretty much around the country. This included things like the DARE program, Dare to Keep Off Drugs. This was a staple in education during, my adolescent years. About 75% of the U.S. Student body for middle and high school received DARE program education, and it was abstinence only. You're going to kind of die if you do drugs. You're a horrible person if you do drugs. So these mass educational campaigns would occur, and it really escalated the use of drug policy to arrest people and really criminalize it in addition to these kind of mass education campaigns. And like I said, throughout this time, there were multiple laws passed during the Reagan administration between 1981 and 1988. And really stepping up, this is where we started to see massive increases in incarceration for simple drug possession. This is also the time, essentially not related to cannabis, but this was also the time when crack cocaine entered the scene and all the racial propaganda that came with that. So cannabis as a drug was kind of linked in with other substances of the time. And again, you see this massive escalation in criminalization of cannabis. And certainly given Nixon and Reagan a bad rap, and in my opinion, they deserve it for all the damage they caused with their drug policies. But I just want to make sure we are not only talking about folks who identify with the Republican Party, because as we go through our timeline in 1994, when President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was president, and a senator in Congress, Joe Biden, who's our current president, passed the crime bill, which was commonly known as the Clinton-Biden crime bill. This took drug criminalization, again, to now a whole new level. They increased fundings for prisons. They increased fundings for police and drug task forces. They increased arrests for cannabis possession. They started increasing police enforcement, and where kind of police could do anything they wanted to under the suspicion of potential drug possession. We saw this massive increase in drug arrests, and this is where we start getting to, over 2 million people being incarcerated, many of which are for simple drug possession. This is also the time where the three strikes law. So even if someone got drug possession charges 3 times, those were considered felonies. 3 felonies, you're in prison for life, just often for simple drug possession. And so again, this anti kind of drug policies and kind of anti-drug propaganda has this dramatic effect in terms of mass incarceration, and of course all the racial discrimination that goes with that, which we'll be talking about in class and in our resources. And so this continued even after the Reagan administration, after the Nixon administration, and again, Democratic leadership, Bill Clinton and Joe Biden, really took it to a whole new level. And so that's kind of the rough timeline of cannabis prohibition. Obviously, 1996, we'll talk about next week, is when California passed medical legalization, and we kind of consider 96 the era of legalization. Now, of course, all these criminalization laws and policies didn't go away. And in fact, in many states, they're still quite prevalent. But this is still that rough timeline of these policies being enacted. Now, I finish just kind of commenting, there were absolutely times when there were opposition to these views. There were people speaking out. Obviously, it didn't work. But it's interesting to see that people were speaking out and kind of what happened. Why didn't these opposing voices who recognized that cannabis was not this horrible substance, why did these voices not kind of, help? And so, interestingly, the first time, maybe not the first time, but one of the key times there was an opposing view to cannabis prohibition was when the Marijuana Tax Act was passed in 1937, and that opposition was by the American Medical Association. In fact, the American Medical Association was the only group that was testifying to oppose the passage of the Cannabis Tax Act or Marijuana Tax Act because they were using it as a medicine and they knew uh, it was helpful. And they knew that it was kind of a farce just lumping this kind of marijuana with cannabis. These are some quotes from the physician that testified. And again, I'm quoting here. I say the medicinal use of cannabis has nothing to do with cannabis or marijuana addiction. In all that you have heard here thus far, no mention has been made of any excessive use of the drug by any doctor or its excessive distribution by any pharmacist. And yet the burden of this bill is placed heavily on the doctors and pharmacists of the country. And I and may I say very heavily, most heavily, possibly of all, on the farmers of this country. Again, we mentioned that hemp was a staple crop throughout uh, essentially the entire forming of the United States of America and throughout the first uh, 150 years of its existence. And this doctor also seriously doubted these claims of marijuana addiction and violence, uh, and even argued that by using the word marijuana, you're essentially blinding the truth. That if you were using the term cannabis, people would know this is not particularly harmful and wouldn't support the bill. Again, nonetheless, the law got passed. 1937, we have um, criminalization. But in 1944, shortly after that, the mayor of New York, LaGuardia, I want to say Edward LaGuardia, but I don't have that in my notes, um, decided, hey, you're telling us all these horrible things about cannabis. Let's study this in depth. And so he and the New York government paid for an in-depth study to look at the effects of smoking cannabis. And this thorough study, looking at all the research, interviews and research studies, talking to doctors, so on and so forth, this LaGuardia report concluded, quote, the publicity concerning the catastrophic effects of marijuana smoking in New York City is unfounded. And again, throughout this report, no longer quoting, but this report systematically contradicted claims that smoking marijuana results in insanity, deteriorates physical and mental health, assists in criminal behavior or delinquency, or is in a gateway or an addictive drug. So again, this massive government report published and pretty much ignored. We kind of move forward into the 70s. Obviously, cannabis use in social settings had grown during that time, and so it was kind of more out there in the public. It's a book that was published called Marijuana Reconsidered by a physician, Lester Grinspoon, who was a Harvard physician. It's a very interesting story, probably more information than you need, but I think it's a really interesting story. So he was good friends with Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was um, entertainment figure, but also a well-known scientist who also was a consumer and a big fan of cannabis. Lester Grinspoon, who did not use any cannabis, was a good friend of Carl Sagan. So he said, basically, I'm going to do all this research to prove to you, Carl, that cannabis is bad. So Grinspoon, being a physician and a researcher, kind of dove into all the research and realized, wow, cannabis wasn't as harmful as he'd been told. And he saw there was all this research suggesting there was potential benefit from cannabis. And kind of a side note to Lester Grinspoon, sadly, as he was doing this research, his son developed cancer, fairly severe cancer, and he was getting chemotherapy and having a horrible time. And at one point, his wife went to his son's high school, bought a couple joints from some friends there, gave a joint to their son prior to chemo, and found it was transformative for him. And there's a story of Lester Grinspoon quoting, I came in to see my son and he looked better than he'd ever seen him throughout his whole cancer treatment. Wife told him she'd given his cannabis, and it's just kind of a full circle moment for him. So I digress, but I think a sad story about his son, but a beautiful story of someone kind of looking at the research and kind of recognizing, hey, I'm actually going to use this research and kind of believe it. I mentioned in 1944 there was this LaGuardia report where they did a massive research study or massive review of all the research and came out with this report. This happened again in 1972. So Nixon took hold of the presidency, created this war on drugs, and said, hey, we're going to get a study proving cannabis is horrible. So he commissioned a report. He commissioned a group known as the Schaefer Group to look at all the research on marijuana. And, he wanted evidence that all his marijuana policies were, scientifically based. So the Schaefer Group looked at all the research out there, similar to that was done in the 40s with the LaGuardia Group, and big shock. They came out with a report titled Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding, and this is a direct quote. The commission is of the unanimous opinion that marijuana use is not such a grave problem that individuals who smoke marijuana and possess it for that purpose should be subject to criminal procedures. Needless to say, Nixon was not a fan of the conclusion of this report, so he squashed the report. No one really ever saw it. He fired all the people who wrote it and went ahead with his war on drugs. I mentioned kind of between Nixon and Reagan, cannabis prohibition, excuse me, took a back seat a little bit. And during that time, President Jimmy Carter took office, and he had his own issues in terms of what was going on in the country, but he didn't really believe in the war on drugs. And this is quotes from President Carter. Penalties against possession of a drug should not be more damaging to an individual than the use of the drug itself. And where they are, they should be changed. Nowhere is this more clear than in the laws against the possession of marijuana in private for personal use. I support legislation amending federal law to eliminate all federal criminal penalties for the possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana. This decriminalization is not legalization. It means only that the federal penalty for possession would be reduced and a person would receive a fine rather than a criminal penalty, end quote. So that was in the late 70s. And really, you can imagine if Carter was able to enact his policies, change the prohibition of cannabis, and kind of essentially do what we've been doing over the past 25 years. You can imagine kind of what the world would look like if Carter was able to do this whole period we talked about with Reagan and even into President Clinton and beyond with mass incarceration and so on and so forth. If Carter had stopped that before it happened, wow, it'd be a pretty different place. But unfortunately, Carter was mired in a whole realm of political problems with inflation and hostage crisis in Iran and a variety of other things. So essentially, this had to take a back seat, and Carter was never able to enact the policies he had hoped. And so these are, again, just some examples of opposing views and where they fit in this timeline. That's kind of it. We'll be talking about more in class, the really ramifications of prohibition, but I wanted to record this separately so you kind of had this both visual timeline, which I've got here. You can see it again, and kind of some understanding behind some of these different laws and policies that were enacted. Hope you guys have a great day, night, or whatever you are doing.